Imagine a prison where inmates rule instead of guards, where there are nightclubs, swimming pools, and even a zoo with exotic animals inside, where the country's most dangerous criminals live in luxurious apartments and have the undisputed right to pass death sentences. This is not the plot of another Mad Max movie. It's the reality of Tocorón prison in Venezuela, the cradle of Latin America's powerful and violent criminal gang, el Tren de Aragua. This gang is truly unique. It's not simply the result of a criminal association that grew and slowly but surely gained its strength. It's the product of economic collapse and the complete disintegration of state institutions throughout the country. The gang was formed in a prison, which almost immediately became no longer a prison, but a real fortified castle, into which income from control over drug trafficking, gold mines, human trafficking, and other means of earning money from almost the entire country flows. And if you're interested in hearing how a group of prisoners managed to create a parallel state and why they're protected by officials, then meet El Tren de Aragua on the other side of the law. While most crime problems in Latin American countries have very distant historical roots, the story of Tren de Aragua deals with the present day. Our story began in 2013 in Venezuela, with the death of Hugo Chavez and the entry of Nicolas Maduro into the political arena. With Maduro's rise to power, the country's economy entered a dark age. Since then, Venezuela's economic situation has only worsened, which has not helped political stability. The inflation that began in Venezuela in 2013 gradually acquired the prefix hyper, reaching a peak of 130,000%. By the beginning of 2023, when the situation had relatively stabilized, it stood at 300 to 400%. Such figures do not just devalue money, they destroy the essence of economic relations. It's difficult to build them when prices for basic products can change dramatically within a day, and the salary paid can become worthless the same day. At the height of the crisis, 3 million people left the country in a relatively short period of time, and these are only the ones who did so officially. There was an incredible contraction of the economy, comparable to that during wartime. The country lost more than 4/5 of its economic potential. The result was widespread comprehensive impoverishment. Not only did savings disappear, but so did jobs, entire industries, and the ability to obtain credit, not just for a house or car, but even for daily expenses on a credit card. Legal avenues to a decent life were blocked for the vast majority of the population. The gangsters, on the other hand, flourished, controlling the black market, which became almost the only place where you could get the things you needed, from gasoline and currency to food and medicine. With such leverage, which brought in a lot of money, the gangsters became the center of attraction for people who were ready to do anything for a better life. Thus, banditry gained enormous power in the country without even making a special effort. However, economic collapse would not have been enough without the parallel and total destruction of the social institutions designed to maintain order. At the heart of this was the complete degradation of the justice system. Since 2004, there's not been a single court decision in favor of an ordinary citizen against the state. The authorities have never lost in court. This is not just evidence of inefficiency, it's proof that the judicial system has transformed into an instrument of repression and protection of power, completely void of independence and the function of arbitration. Systemic corruption has flourished on the ruins of justice. It's no longer a matter of isolated cases of abuse, it's become the very logic of the system's functioning. From obtaining the simplest document to a business license, everything requires an extra payment and connections with the right people. This leads to another, more dangerous aspect: the merging of crime with the system of state administration. This merger can take various forms, from simple corruption to outright extortion by state means and forces, and sometimes even the completely official establishment of crime in a leading state position. All state authorities have a monopoly on violence. Only law enforcement agencies and the military have the right to use force. This is not the case in Venezuela, though. Gangsters have gained control over certain territories and power within them. They have taken it upon themselves to ensure security in the regions, charging money for this security, and establishing their own rules, which naturally are beneficial to crime. The criminal elements that have merged with the state even control the distribution of resources such as gas, electricity, and water. In such situations, everyone has been forced to reckon with crime, regardless of how they personally feel about criminals. Government officials, police, and military have become either accomplices or beneficiaries of illegal activity. The most striking manifestation of this merger is control over prisons. 8 penitentiaries in Venezuela have long been under the control of pranis, criminal leaders who have turned the prisons into their own autonomous principalities. These prisons have their own rules, their own economy, their own entertainment, and their own power, all of which they control. The state has effectively delegated the management of these institutions to criminals, creating enclaves where crime reigns supreme. The most famous such prison is Tocorón, also known as the Aragua Penitentiary Center. However, this situation did not develop overnight. The problem went through several stages of development. The early stage was in the 1990s. During this period, prisons were a place where the state's cruelty and lawlessness were concentrated on all fronts. There was incredible overcrowding everywhere, and there was not enough food. The prison administration was a real force at that time. Yes, the guards were already quite far from the law and the essence of the penitentiary system, but the prisoners could not dictate their own laws to them. It was easy to pay for this with your life. The second stage is sometimes referred to simply as the Chavez period, which lasted from the early 2000s until the end of Hugo's term. In the early stages of Hugo Chávez's presidency, before 2005, there was an even greater tightening of the detention regime, complete disregard for the rights and freedoms of citizens, and most importantly, a gradual distancing of federal power from the management of the prison system. During this period, internal prison authority gained strength with the direct participation of prison guards. Surprisingly, one of the reasons for this growth was food. The state significantly reduced supplies to prisons, and prisoners found themselves in a situation where food had to be obtained through smuggling, which the guards made their source of income. Because of this, prisoners began to create various types of savings funds and taxes for and from inmates simply for the sake of survival, which ultimately led to the emergence of a special prison system of relationships called pranaro, in which the prison leader, or pran, appears. Pranis are a unique product of the prison system. They're not crime bosses from the outside world. Most pranis gained this status while behind bars, acting as overseers of specific wards, blocks, and sometimes entire prisons. The main function of these leaders is to communicate with the prison security system, which, becoming increasingly corrupt, gradually transfers more and more power into the hands of these respected individuals. Very quickly, it reached the point where the pranis received weapons and freedom of action over any business inside the prisons from the guards in exchange for bribes and maintaining the appearance of control over the situation. The state, unable or unwilling to manage prisons, effectively criminalized their privatization by handing over full authority to the pranis. They took control over all aspects of life: food, security, medical care, entertainment, and employment for prisoners. By 2005 to 2007, pranis had become a universal phenomenon and were present in all prisons. In some, they even took over external security. Naturally, in such conditions, the local emperors began to establish their own internal laws and collect tribute. The gangs created amazing living conditions for themselves: full-fledged dance clubs, drug dens, swimming pools, comfortable living spaces, medical care, everything you could wish for. But all the other prisoners were in even worse condition than under the state control. Hugo Chávez was not only the head of the state, but also a leader who had very serious support. When he passed away, a new phase of systemic crisis began, affecting absolutely all spheres of life, and the prison, which was already in an extremely sad state, completely deteriorated. The Maduro period is most vividly illustrated by the Tocorón prison, where the state authorities removed themselves in the truest sense of the word. By this point, the pranis in Tocorón had absolute power. It was their fighters who had a monopoly on violence. Only their men carried weapons. The pranis acted as judges and often decided who would live and who would die. Even freedom could be sold by these leaders, because they controlled the guards. However, although the pranis had the right to perform social functions in prisons, in practice, they did not. That's why after 2012, death from starvation has dominated in prisons. Medical care in such institutions is provided on an exclusively personal basis. Do you have money and power? We'll treat you. No money and no power? We won't. It's believed that 8 of Venezuela's 53 prisons are completely and directly controlled by pranis. In the rest, their influence is still enormous. It's difficult to trace the emergence of Tren de Aragua. The first legally confirmed mentions of this gang date back to 2014, when they were already involved in extortion in prison, but they became widely known in 2015 during a police operation that was quite embarrassing for the Venezuelan authorities, which we'll discuss later. The name of the gang, Tren de Aragua, translates as the Aragua train. Since the group originated in the state of Aragua, the media quickly came up with a version of how the gang came into being and how it got its name. In 2006, during Hugo Chávez's presidency, a very large railway line was to be built in the state of Aragua. Construction was carried out there by the municipality of Girardot. By the end of the aughts, the project had stalled due to lack of funding, corruption, and ineffective management. The work was effectively abandoned, leaving behind unfinished tracks, abandoned depots, and equipment. The workers suffered the most. They were left without jobs, without pay, and without any guarantees. All they had left were unfinished buildings, which very quickly became home to gangs. It's believed that one of these gangs was the Tren de Aragua. However, this version is refuted by one of the gang members who was once close to the top. This man's name is Yandres, and he said that the real reason for the name was that the gang wanted to follow in the footsteps of its powerful criminal predecessors, primarily the Tren del Llano gang. That's why it named itself in a similar way. However, as usual, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. It's quite possible that the gang was indeed made up of former railway workers, but then, when some of them ended up in Tocorón prison, the gang was reborn under new leadership and in a new role. The Tren de Aragua gang is now run by the Three Popes, 3 virtually equal criminal leaders, Niño Guerrero, Johan Petrica, and Larry Chunga. Formally, Niño Guerrero is the leader, but he's more of a leader of the prison structure, and the gang quickly grew beyond the prison walls. However, 2 other names were prominent in the gang's early history. Carlos Rafael Galindez Gratero, nicknamed Carlitos Breaker, and Jose Gabriel Alvarez Rojas, nicknamed El Chino Pedrera. The latter, a native of Maracaibo, was a serious figure in the world of Venezuelan crime. For example, in 2016, he decided to introduce a curfew in a large city with a significant military presence, which no one was allowed to violate. However, 2 weeks later, he was killed, presumably by his own bodyguards. He had been too open about his power and influence. He's believed to have been one of the original leaders of the Tren de Aragua, and it was his fighters who formed the backbone of the gang. Another founder died even earlier, Carlos Galindez, a native of the Maracay area in Aragua, who died in 2015. That year, there was a very serious internal war over drug revenues, and Carlitos Breaker did not share where he should have. This story would later continue at the very top. Photos of the dismembered Carlitos would be found on the phones of the nephews of Nicolas Maduro's wife, Silvia Flores, who were somehow involved in his death, but this story never came to any conclusion. However, these were the quote-unquote leaders outside of prison. Those who are commonly referred to as true gang leaders were within its extremely hospitable walls. Tocorón is a system with its own complex social pyramid. At the top of this pyramid is the main pran, Hector Guerrero Flores, better known as El Niño Guerrero, which can be translated as the boy warrior. Within the system, he is the pran or principal. His power is exercised through an extensive network of trusted individuals and a strict system of subordination. Directly below Niño Guerrero in the hierarchy are 2 other principals. Together, they form a ruling triumvirate that manages the daily life and criminal enterprises of Tocorón. They live in a special area of the prison, Millionaire Row, in comfortable apartments. Guerrero himself lives in a mansion with a swimming pool and a barbecue area. Their status allows them to move freely around the prison, enjoy all the benefits, and give orders to their subordinates. To get into this inner circle, you have to distinguish yourself through your service to the gang and personally to Guerrero. Formally, the triumvirate can expand if a new member can prove their usefulness to the organization. There are some reasons to believe that several other people who manage the gang's overseas activities in different regions have equal status, but their names are hidden and their status is not officially confirmed at this time. The next critically important level in the hierarchy is occupied by the Luceros de la Alta, which can translate as stars of the highest light. These are the pranis' trusted representatives outside the prison. They can leave the prison at the discretion of the bosses to manage Tren de Aragua's criminal operations both within Venezuela and in other Latin American countries. They are the tentacles of the organization on the outside, coordinating control over territories and illegal businesses. Inside the prison, they also enjoy enormous respect and privileges. If the Luceros de la Alta are the brain and nerves of the organization on the outside, the next step in the hierarchy is the Luceros de la Baja, stars of the lower ranks, the muscle behind the pranis' regime inside and outside the penitentiary. Next come the garroteros. This is a network of observers and informants scattered throughout the prison. Their task is to constantly monitor all areas, identifying any signs of disloyalty, rule violations, or potential threats. At the very bottom of the Tocorón hierarchy are the varones or manchados, the outcasts. This is the most disenfranchised and humiliated group of prisoners, living in extreme poverty and constant danger. There are several reasons for ending up in this caste. The first is not having enough money to pay the mandatory weekly casa, or tax, of $15, which is a fee for the right to live normally in the prison. The second is committing crimes on the inside that violate the pran's rules. Manchados are required to wear distinctive clothing, plaid, stripped, or colored long-sleeve shirts, which immediately sets them apart and marks them as outcasts. They live in local slums with dirt, garbage, and stagnant water. They're strictly forbidden to leave their area under threat of severe corporal punishment or even death. They have no access to the benefits of prison and live in miserable handmade huts. Relatives visit members of this caste in the most unpleasant conditions. They're given dilapidated huts for meetings, which could collapse at any moment, and visits can be refused for absolutely any reason. Yet, meetings with relatives are sometimes their only source of food and medical care. The last group, which stands apart from the prison hierarchy, is sincere Christians, whom the leaders, especially Niño Guerrero, respect in their own way. Latin American criminals have a rather specific attitude toward religion. They're devout and do not tolerate the desecration of religion, which, however, does not prevent them from breaking all possible laws of God. Therefore, all kinds of false prophets who ended up in prison were in mortal danger. But those who were considered true believers were given a different status. They had to be an example to other prisoners. They had to lead a religious life, pray, and help those around them. These people were under the special protection of local crime bosses, and it was forbidden to harm them. However, the believers themselves had to lead an ideal lifestyle in accordance with their deep religious beliefs. As can be seen from all of this, the hierarchy in prison is quite complex, a kind of state within a state. But despite the fact that this system greatly influenced the formation of the Tren de Aragua gang, we can't ignore its leaders, who were responsible for its development. Most often, the main boss, El Niño Guerrero, is mentioned from this prison triumvirate, but we believe that this is wrong, and that the other two deserve no less attention. Let's start with Larry Chunga. Larry Amaury Alvarez Núñez, known as Larry Chunga, is one of the links between the gang and the federal state, practically a symbol of their merger. Larry himself grew up in a poor Venezuelan family. His older brother was killed by the police, and his younger brother was locked up for drug trafficking. Larry himself would receive 17.5 years for intentional homicide during a robbery. And in 2011, his Schrodinger's release would take place by decision of the Supreme Court, which was kind of there, but at the same time, kind of not. Legally, there was no early release, but after the judges ruled in favor of Larry's appeal, he was set free, and there's no documentary evidence of his release. But he's not in prison either, and he did not escape. The early release of the murderer caused quite a stir in the media, and the fact that one of the judges later fled the country, having already been charged and admitted to falsifying sentences, added fuel to the fire. It's different to imagine a more vivid confirmation that the judicial system lacked any objectivity or integrity and did exactly what it was told to do. And who exactly gave the orders is still an open question. Larry was involved in all cases of the gang's expansion, whether in Venezuela or abroad. For example, when the gang turned its attention to Chile, Larry was caught by the Chilean police, but then miraculously slipped from their hands. Changa also had a direct influence on the highest echelons of government. For example, in 2015, documents were found indicating that Larry was an employee of the Ministry of Health. But that's not all. Not only is Changa a criminal, but at least during one period of his employment at the Ministry of Health, he was serving a prison sentence. He was physically unable to work at the ministry, but he not only worked, he was officially registered in the Social Security system and paid the required contributions. Larry is the most secretive prankster of all, and virtually nothing is known about his life. According to some sources, he's been living in the US with his family since 2022, but there's no confirmation of this information, and he's currently wanted in his homeland. The second person is the complete opposite of Larry. This is the prankster Johan Petrica. This man is known by various names: Johan Jose Romero, El Viejo, or El Viejo Darwin. He's considered one of the architects of the criminal management model that led Tren de Aragua to prosperity. The fact is that Petrica was involved in organizing the gang's formation. He transferred the usual prison norms and hierarchy beyond the prison walls and was responsible for the global concept of expanding the gang. His main personal achievement was the colossal growth of the gang's income after expanding its zone of influence to the Orinoco mining arc. There, under the pseudonym El Viejo, he did not simply head the local mining syndicate, controlling the critically important 88th kilometer and Venezuela's largest gold deposit. He transformed the area into a powerful economic engine and logistics hub for Tren de Aragua, establishing tight control over gold mining and sales, as well as over the entire population and businesses in the controlled territory. However, Petrica not only made money, but also spent it ostentatiously. He wore the best designer clothes, huge gold chains, and owned a luxurious multi-story mansion. If you imagine a rich criminal as a guy lazily floating around in a vault full of gold, that's Petrica. Moreover, he deliberately flaunted his status, showing that he had no one to hide from, that he was rich, powerful, authoritative, and knew exactly what he was doing. Within the Tren de Aragua hierarchy, Petrica is the link between the so-called old guard and the prison-based gang and its new, extremely profitable economic enterprises on the outside. His ability to coordinate the flow of people, such as the transfer of prisoners to mines as cheap labor, and resources between the prison world and the outside world, is the cornerstone of Tren de Aragua's current power and stability. However, despite Johan's enormous importance, he's not the head of the gang. The undisputed leader, as we've said, is El Niño Guerrero, sometimes referred to as the untouchable king of Tocorón. Guerrero comes from a completely ordinary family and began his criminal career as an adult. He got into serious trouble with the law at around the age of 20 and has been charged with more than 10 offenses, including the murder of a police officer. Behind bars, he quickly earned the title of Chief Pran and now feels at home. He has the most luxurious house and the greatest access to everything he needs. For him, it's not even a prison, but his own personal fortress. It was from his headquarters in Tocorón that Guerrero coordinated activities and directed the flow of illegal goods. And it was here that he made his decisions about key military actions and human trafficking channels throughout South America. His ability to manage such a large-scale network while formerly in prison is unique, and it's frankly difficult to compare it to anything else. It's impossible to say when the gang began to actively expand beyond the prison walls. Such actions are usually only recorded after the destruction of the group and a detailed investigation, but there's one event that we can definitely note. Let's go back to May 2015, to the San Vicente area of Aragua. The authorities were conducting a large-scale operation against gangs. All possible security forces were being drawn to the area. A total of 1,500 fighters from various units carried out the operation. As you can imagine, an operation of this scale could only end in success. The region has been liberated from the rule of pranis, eliminated. Johan Petrica, Larry Changa, and Niño Guerrero, declared the local media. Triumph, victory, success. However, the reality turned out to be a cynical spectacle. Neither the bodies of the supposed killed bosses nor their names were presented in the official reports. Formally, the state eliminated a large and dangerous gang and joyfully reported this to the public. However, the destruction of organized crime does not simply imply the destruction of crime as a whole. It was precisely to protect peaceful people from possible violence that the region was recognized as a zone of peace, in which the local governor and other existing administrative bodies were supposed to normalize the situation. Since there would be no systemic opposition, the gang had been destroyed from an official point of view. The only problem is that the gang had not been destroyed, and its forces significantly exceed those of the local law enforcement agencies. In fact, power was transferred to the gang by the state, which allowed the model of criminal rule, first tested in Tocorón prison, to be expanded. This model is based on a system of compulsory taxation known as vacuna. Virtually every businessman in Aragua state pays this tax. No matter how big they are, even international corporations that want to work there pay it. On average, it ranges from 10% for small businesses up to 30 to 50% for large enterprises. At the same time, a significant number of people pay the tax completely voluntarily, at least some order in its area of influence. The amount of tax is determined by an audit. Competent people working for the Tren de Aragua conduct financial audits of enterprises to establish a fair amount of tribute. Some enterprises, especially in the food industry, pay in kind, with whole truckloads of food, which are then sold inside the prison or on the black market. Experts estimate that TDA can receive between $100,000 and $700,000 at a time from each large vacuna operation. No one can say yet how many operations the gang carries out. Those who don't pay are, of course, subject to terror. For example, in 2019, the Puig factory was burned down after refusing to pay. The gangsters first broke into the guarded territory with a fight and set fire to the buildings, then started shooting at the firefighters, preventing them from extinguishing the fire until the damage to the factory became critical. Only then did they allow the firefighters to put it out. To give their actions the appearance of legitimacy, the gang created the Somos el Barrio JK Foundation. Under the guise of charitable contributions, the foundation collected money from the vacuna and helped launder other criminal proceeds. The gang also assumed the functions of the judiciary in the territory. Conflicts between residents and disputes between businessmen were resolved by so-called Tren de Aragua judges directly in the Tocorón prison or in controlled locations in nearby San Vicente. Critical infrastructure facilities, schools, hospitals, food outlets, water purification systems came under indirect control. The gangsters did not manage them directly, but appointed overseers and provided security only to those who were loyal and paid. The next big step was the seizure of the 88th kilometer gold mines in Las Claritas, state of Bolívar. In 2015, Johan Patrica went there with a group of prisoners from Tocorón. The gang drove out local miners and rival gangs by force. Resistance was suppressed by public executions, dismemberment of bodies, and other acts of cruelty. The economic model built by the gangsters after seizing the mines was based on two pillars. The first was direct extraction. Tren de Aragua controlled key mines, using the labor, often in slave-like conditions, of local residents, migrants, and prisoners who were transferred there. Second, a system of extortion from everyone working in the area. Independent miners, traders, shop owners, even prostitutes all paid tribute for the right to be and work in the Venezuelan El Dorado. The region, the richest in the country in terms of gold reserves, one Canadian company ranked it fourth in terms of gold potential, has turned into an enclave governed by the laws of prison pranado. Very important to emphasize that the gang in this place is the authority. It receives a percentage from all companies, including international ones, that mine gold. The gang's own gold mining is quite limited, although it does take place, as it's a difficult and rather complex business to manage. The next pillar of the gang's existence is drug trafficking. And this is where TDA differs greatly from many other groups in the region. The fact is that the gang does not plan to engage in large-scale drug production or sales. Of course, this business flourishes directly inside the prison. A certain amount of marijuana is grown for their own needs, and there's even a chemical laboratory where a number of synthetic drugs are made. But this is, in fact, a drop in the ocean. According to various estimates, the gang's turnover inside the prison is a paltry $200,000 to $300,000. Even if we take the highest estimates, taking into account that the prisoners buy drugs for resale, we're talking about $1 million a year, which is not that much money for a gang of this size. The gold mine is a transit point. International trafficking of hard drugs goes through territories where the gang has complete control. cocaine from Colombia enters the states of Apure and Táchira, then crosses Venezuela in transit to the coastal city of Carúpano in the state of Sucre. Here, using fishing companies and canneries as cover, the drugs are packaged and shipped to the Caribbean islands, or Europe on fishing vessels. The route is dangerous but profitable. TDA provides cargo security and logistics, acting as a highly paid transporter and security guard for the cartels, who are the real owners of the goods. Naturally, the gang charges a lot of money for this. Exactly how much is impossible to say, as the leaders or direct participants who could shed light on the matter have not yet been apprehended. Another source of income is kidnapping and human trafficking. The most high-profile case occurred in January 2017. A Spanish citizen living in Venezuela was kidnapped by an armed group posing as police officers while driving through the country. His brother, who was traveling with him, was released with the task of collecting 500,000 euros. To speed up the ransom payment, the gangsters constantly called with threats and cut off the victim's finger, sending it to his relatives. All this attracted the attention of international law enforcement agencies. As a result of a joint operation involving special forces from different countries, the man was freed after 38 days. The investigation confirmed Tren de Aragua's involvement. More common, but no less sad, are so-called express kidnappings. A striking example is the story of Anatoly Kurmanev, a correspondent for the New York Times in Venezuela. In October 2020, while returning to the capital Caracas in an armored car, he was stopped at a fake checkpoint on the border between Carabobo and Aragua, where armed men kidnapped him and demanded 40 grand from his relatives for his release. Negotiators, noting the kidnappers' very strange behavior, they needed to get money very urgently before dawn, concluded that they were ordinary TDA fighters who had to return to prison by morning. The negotiators deliberately delayed the payment of the ransom, and as a result, Kurmanov and the driver's lives were saved. They were released at dawn without payment, with only the journalist's cash and watch being taken. The investigation later confirmed that the kidnappers' phone signals were picked up near Tocorón, and that their methods were very common with other foreigners. The fact is that this is not the policy of the gang, but simply individual bandits who, having paid a tax for the opportunity to work in the territory, engage in illegal freelance activities. However, the gang itself is involved in large-scale kidnappings. According to data from the Venezuelan Ministry of Interior, Justice and Peace, 92 kidnappings were reported in Aragua alone between 2016 and 2019. And these are only the official figures that have reached the local authorities. However, they kidnap not only people, but also property. Another source of money is car theft. TDA militants, often again under the guise of police, block roads and seize expensive cars. They then contact the owners and demand a ransom for the return of the car. Payment is made directly to the Tocorón prison cashier's office. Some of the cars are resold, while others are dismantled for parts. Naturally, this refers to those which no ransom was paid for or which they had no intention of returning. However, kidnapping for ransom and car theft are just the tip of the iceberg compared to the gang's other activities, which are probably the most brutal and reprehensible on their list. We're talking about human trafficking, primarily for sexual exploitation. Recruitment takes place in Venezuela. Women are offered jobs abroad as waitresses, dancers, or models. They're promised quick money and legal employment. The promise is that as soon as they work off the costs of travel and paperwork, usually a fantastical $10,000 to $15,000, they'll be free. Unfortunately, the reality is far from that simple. Once they arrive in the destination country, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador have become the main bases. The victims find themselves completely under the control of Tren de Aragua. Their documents are immediately taken away. They're placed in brothels that are under the strict control of the group. The girls are often raped and beaten there. The myth of buying freedom is just a tool for psychological control. The debt is gradually and artificially inflated, and various penalties are imposed. Even if by some miracle the amount is paid off, the woman does not become free. She's forced to continue paying a monthly vacuna to TDA for the right to work independently. Very often, victims of human trafficking cannot change their field of activity, simply because they need to pay taxes, they need to pay for housing, they need to have money to live, and they only have one trade. Not long ago, the Chilean prosecutor's office investigating TDA uncovered a network of their illegal brothels in Chile. According to their calculations, the network in one city brought the gang about $700,000 a month. Again, it's impossible to talk about the real scale at this point because the gang is still in operation. Right now, the gang is also actively engaged in extortion in an area that, if you will, can be called Venezuela's national treasure. We're talking about baseball. The importance of baseball for the country cannot be overestimated. Socially, it's a tremendous social ladder. You can practically become a national hero, even if you are the third son of a poor family, if you reach the heights of baseball. In addition, it's a multi-million-dollar business on which the lives of hundreds of thousands of young people depend, in the truest sense. Venezuela can claim the status of School of Future MLB Stars, that's Major League Baseball. Of course, such a situation could not help but attract criminals who decided that everything should be taxed. The training of young talent in the country works mainly through a system of private academies that invest in the search, training, and promotion of young talents who are called prospects. The academy invests in a prospect's food, equipment, training, and accommodation. And if the contract is successfully signed with a professional club, it receives 40% of the player's signing bonus. First and foremost, the gangsters imposed a vacuna on baseball academies. The gang considers those located in its area of influence to be legitimate commercial enterprises that are required to pay tribute. The size of the vacuna in this case differs from other commercial organizations. It's a fixed amount, according to police, from $50,000 to $100,000 US, for the very right of the academy to exist and a percentage of the prospect's bonuses. In the case of non-payment of the required funds, I think you can guess what happens to the owners. However, the problems of baseball are, in fact, the problems of the entire country. Society, by and large, cannot oppose the gang, and there are good reasons for this. The first and most important reason is the colossal, all-consuming poverty of the population. It was not for nothing that I told you at the beginning about the social and economic pit that the federal state has fallen into. This pit provides the gang with such a reliable social supply that even more serious organizations sometimes don't have. The first and most important source of new recruits for the gang is, in fact, Tocorón prison and other prisons where the gang is at its strongest. You're already familiar with the social conditions in this prison, and the internal hierarchy means that only gang members can live a normal life. Crime in Latin America is very young in terms of the age of its participants, and young men who perceive the gang as an obvious social ladder find themselves in prison for the first time, especially given that the gang is the real power in the region. Even if a person doesn't want to be a gangster, it's the gang that provides employment in its own, or controlled, enterprises. If a person simply wants to work in peace, he's also forced to get involved with the gang, since in some regions it's physically impossible to work without receiving a kind of approval from the gang. This problem also affects those who want to change their lives by fleeing the country. Migrants desperate to leave fall into a separate trap at the borders. They're offered help in crossing the border for a huge amount of money, and then they're enslaved by debt or forced to transport drugs. Refusing or trying to leave is deadly dangerous. The gang has repeatedly dealt with civilians who have defied them or tried to deceive them. In recent years, there's also been a small revolution in the gang's social stratification. This is due to the criminal organization's entry into the international arena. Of course, they have not stopped recruiting marginalized people from prisons and slums, but they have begun to look at other levels. In recent years, the gang has begun to recruit white-collar workers with a wide range of skills. Completely civilian managers have appeared who are improving the vacuna system, making it more stable and predictable. And stability brings in more and more income. The gang now has highly professional lawyers who are primarily engaged in international communication with companies operating in the gang's territory. This is no longer a conversation between a powerful local Indian and a white man who wants to buy the right to mine gold for beads. It's a clear legal dispute between two respected parties over the terms of a contract, and the fact that one of the parties is a criminal organization has no real significance. Big business negotiates with those who can guarantee the fulfillment of the terms, not with those who formally own the territory. In this case, the formal owner, the state, simply receives its specified percentage. The gang has its own accountants who launder money through the legal business system, including in other countries, while IT specialists ensure cybersecurity and the gang's immersion in the world of high-tech business and investment. At the same time, all undesirable information is tracked on social networks and the most significant platforms for information exchange in the region. The gang truly controls every aspect of the lives of its members and victims. The latter are effectively trapped, as turning to the authorities is tantamount to suicide, and their distrust of the state is entirely justified. Criminals have deeply infiltrated all levels of government. For example, Governor Rangal Gomez openly supported the gangsters. The military at checkpoints near San Juan de Unare effectively guard drug trafficking, and the police release captured militants on orders from above in such conditions. Faith in the protection of the state is naivety that can cost lives. One might be outraged. Why is the government doing nothing about the situation? In addition to the obvious reasons, there's another. The gang is beneficial to the current political regime. There's no clear and irrefutable evidence of this, but former gang members have said that the gang does not simply exist with the permission of top leadership, but is directly used by state structures as illegal armed cover. This primarily concerns the two largest waves of protests that shook the country in 2017 and 2019. The mechanism of recruiting prisoners to suppress protests in the country was a well-established practice. Through corrupt officials in the prison service and regional authorities, the ruling regime established direct contacts with the leaders of outlaw groups, primarily with the top pranis of Tocorón prison. In exchange for cash payments, preferential conditions, or future political concessions, pranis provided the authorities with squads of prisoners. These guys were not simply released onto the streets. They were deliberately used as a strike force in situations where the use of regular police and army units could have caused an international scandal or was politically inadvisable. Acting under the direction or with the full connivance of the official security forces, these groups operated with particular brutality. Their tasks went far beyond restoring order. They carried out classic intimidation tactics against opposition leaders and activists, violently dispersed peaceful marches, and staged provocative attacks to discredit the entire protest movement. After completing their tasks, the militants returned to their cells, which guaranteed them immunity from prosecution, as they had an ironclad alibi. They were in prison. This symbiosis was mutually beneficial. The regime gained an effective and completely deniable instrument of violence, while criminal authorities strengthened their status and power. This collusion penetrates deep into the security forces, with the result that the military and police not only turn a blind eye to the activities of the TDA, but also actively participate in supporting them. A striking example is the unhindered trafficking of weapons. The main supplier of weapons to the Venezuelan black market is the state-owned arms industry itself, in particular the largest state-owned company, CAVIM, the Venezuelan Company of Military Industries, which supplies the army. A significant portion of the firearms and ammunition used by the gang is of quote official origin, having been stolen from army warehouses or illegally sold by corrupt military personnel. This provides the gang with a modern and standardized arsenal that surpasses the firepower of ordinary police units. Physical control over key territories is also exercised with the connivance or direct assistance of the official authorities. Prison security, formally entrusted to the National Guard, effectively ensures the inviolability of the internal order established by the pranis. After all, the core of the gang is safe there. Another gang cannot attack the prison, because in that case, the attack would be repelled by regular military personnel. Corruption also permeates civilian institutions, primarily the Ministry of Interior, Justice, and Peace, and the penitentiary system. I've already mentioned that even gang leaders had official documents confirming their high status. The problem with such fake documents is that they are not really fake. They are completely real, valid documents, officially registered. But one person can have several of them. In fact, it's no problem for gang members to travel internationally, even if they're currently serving time, because the criminal has a valid passport, just under a different name. The danger of such a merger cannot be overestimated, because it effectively removes the status of repeat offender and completely nullifies the possibility of state control over criminals of any scale. A criminal can hold high-ranking positions, even government posts, because at any moment he can acquire a new, legally clean identity. And this is not a separate service for the highest gangster hierarchs, but an established practice. The links between the criminal leadership and the authorities are also beyond doubt. The governor of Aragua state personally visited the Tocorón prison to negotiate with TDA leader El Niño Guerrero about providing men for various tasks, even requesting a ceasefire at certain moments of the territorial redistribution between gangs. At present, there's no clear confirmation that the country's top politicians are members of the gang, but according to insiders from some former members of this criminal community, a significant part of the income from gold mines goes precisely to maintaining their state apparatus. A certain indirect confirmation of this can be found in a section of interviews with former Minister of Penitentiary Affairs Maria Iris Varela, who held her post from 2011 to 2020 and then moved onto the position of Aragua State Governor. Her public statements and policies were aimed at demonstrating the federal state's full control over the situation. The position of Varela and the agency she headed was to categorically reject the PRAN model itself. In a 2014 interview, which was conducted in an entirely official capacity, she publicly declared that the PRAN model had been overcome in regional prisons and in the prison system as a whole, although this was not the case. Varela's denial of the problem was not just empty words or some kind of play to the public. The entire work of the prison system, all propaganda and informational activities, was aimed at presenting the country's prisons as spaces where constitutional order had been restored. Instead of fighting the PRAN system, the ministry essentially legalized, or rather, legitimized it. While this woman was in ministerial positions, the TDA significantly expanded its influence in the state of Sucre. To take over drug trafficking on the Paria Peninsula, the gang used inmates from Tocorón as fighters. They were promised freedom in exchange for participating in bloody clashes with local gangs. After the success of the operations, these criminals were indeed released and remained to control the conquered territories. This is how they found out. An unexpectedly large number of former inmates of the prison later found themselves all in one place and with a released status. And in these circumstances, the relevant minister calmly declared that the PRAN system did not exist and that Niño Guerrero was just an ordinary prisoner, perhaps more respected by other prisoners, but nothing more. It's not surprising that in such a situation, the gang feels completely at ease and is actively expanding beyond the country's borders into Latin America and, of course, the United States. Let's start with Colombia, for the expansion of Tren de Aragua, where they are trying to integrate into the underground economy of large cities, primarily in the drug trade. This has naturally provoked wars with local gangs. There have been known cases of clashes with factions of Los Paisas or the office of Envigado. However, the most fierce confrontation is unfolding in the border regions, where TDA's interests have clashed with Colombian guerrilla groups. At the same time, after demonstrating their strength to each other, the gangs are increasingly choosing not to destroy each other, but to negotiate and form criminal alliances. A striking example of such cooperation was the murder of Paraguayan prosecutor Marcelo Pesci in Cartagena, Colombia. It's still difficult to say who exactly ordered his murder, because Pesci managed to cause a lot of trouble for gang cartels, not only in Colombia, but also in his home country of Paraguay, as well as Uruguay and Brazil. However, it is known for certain that his murder was planned and organized by Colombian gangs together with TDA fighters. In Chile, the gang is represented by much the same as in Colombia. This country, being one of the most developed in the region, has become a magnet for Venezuelan migrants, which TDA immediately took advantage of. The gang established almost total control over illegal crossings of the northern border in the Tarapacá region, charging migrants and other criminal groups for the rite of passage. In addition, large-scale trafficking of ketamine, a drug not commonly found in the region, was established. In Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil, TDA's operations have their own distinct characteristics, determined by geographical location and local opportunities. Peru was the first country where the gang's presence was documented. It's known for certain that they control illegal routes for smuggling people into Peru. In Brazil, after crossing the border of the state of Roraima, gang members began investing in real estate in its capital, Boa Vista, and engaged in small-scale drug trafficking, human trafficking, and illegal gold mining in the Amazon. The key to their expansion in Brazil was forming an alliance with local group, the First Capital Command, or PCC. Tren de Aragua ensured the security of drug trafficking in its territory, supplied the PCC with weapons and women, and protected illegal miners on Venezuelan territory, receiving in return financial and logistical support throughout the PCC's territory. The gang is trying to build similar alliances, albeit on a smaller scale, in other countries, sometimes from a position of strength, sometimes as supposed equals, or simply by purchasing the necessary service if the local crime groups happen to be stronger. In Argentina, things are not going as well for the gang as it would like. Guillermo Boscon Bracho, known as Yyi, one of the gang's leaders abroad, was arrested there while organizing a money laundering network. He entered Argentina on a fake Colombian passport and, most surprisingly, obtained an Argentine identity card, while wanted in his home country for extortion. The cell had been operating since 2021, running a Western Union currency exchange office and conducting a huge number of financial transactions. Tren de Aragua's presence in Bolivia remains fairly limited and inconspicuous against the backdrop of dominant Brazilian cartels, which have controlled drug trafficking along the extensive Brazil-Bolivia border for decades. TDA is also infiltrating the United States, creating new problems for American law enforcement. Moreover, this infiltration is taking place through entirely legal institutions. For example, in Florida, a church was established at the instigation of the gang, and it was through this church that assistance and coordination were provided to members of Tren de Aragua. In 2025, the U.S. Department of State recognized it as a foreign terrorist organization along with Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, and Mexican drug cartels. Shortly before that, the gang had also been hit in its homeland. In September 2023, Venezuelan security forces carried out an operation storming the Tocorón prison, which you're already familiar with. The official goal of the operation, codenamed Cacique Guasaporo Liberation Operation, was to regain control of the prison, which had been completely under the control of the inmates for decades. And here, I will remind you again that the relevant minister denied even the possibility of such power. However, the main result turned out to be different and caused a scandal. The authorities confirmed that the gang leaders, in particular El Niño Guerrero, had fled in advance, and they were only put on the wanted list sometime after the assault, which was clearly enough time for them to leave the country. This delay sparked a wave of criticism of Nicolás Maduro's regime, because without corruption at the highest level, such a thing would be impossible. The operation itself was large-scale. More than 11,000 military and police personnel were involved in taking the complex. What they found inside resembled more of a movie set than a prison. The prison grounds included, among other things, a nightclub, a zoo with exotic animals, and even a baseball field. But the main discovery was a colossal arsenal of weapons, anti-tank grenades, 15 rocket-propelled grenades, 80 kilos of C4 explosives, 14 long-range firearms, and 400,000 rounds of ammunition were seized, which were clearly intended for a much larger arsenal that had apparently been removed beforehand. Although control over the prison has apparently been restored, it's difficult to call this a victory. The gang has been dealt a minor blow, but its power in the surrounding areas remains unshaken. Only time will tell what will happen next to Tren de Aragua.